When my dad said, "You'll never amount to anything, you're just like your mother's side," I left the house for good. 15 years later, I returned, not as a son, but as the investor who bought their home's mortgage. My mom begged me, "Please don't do this," but it wasn't her decision anymore. Look, I never thought I'd be sharing this on Reddit, but I need to get this off my chest. Some of you might think I'm the AH here, and honestly, maybe I am, but after what happened last week, I just need to put this somewhere. Growing up in our little ranch-style house in Michigan wasn't exactly what you'd call a Norman Rockwell painting. Dad, Richard, was the kind of guy who thought screaming was communication and belittling was motivation. Mom, Phyllis, was just there. Physically present, but emotionally checked out, like someone who's accepted that the volume on her life would forever be set to mute. I was the disappointing only child. At least that's what Dad made sure I knew from basically the time I could understand words. Here's the thing about growing up with someone who constantly tells you you're worthless. Eventually, you start to believe it. When I brought home B's, Dad would ask why they weren't A's. When I brought home A's, he'd ask why I wasn't in more advanced classes. When I made the basketball team sophomore year, he wanted to know why I wasn't a starter. Nothing was ever enough. The worst part was how he'd always drag my mom's family into it. Her brother Roy and their parents were apparently the source of everything wrong with me. Dad would look at my report card, shake his head, and tell me I had the same lazy attitude as my mother's side. When I couldn't fix the lawnmower, I was useless with tools just like Uncle Roy. When I wanted to try out for debate team instead of football, I was soft just like my grandfather had been. I remember being 13, sitting at our kitchen table trying to figure out some algebra homework. Dad walked by, glanced at my paper, and snorted. He told me math wasn't for everyone, especially people with my mother's blood. Then he walked away, cracked open a beer, and turned the TV volume up so I couldn't concentrate. Mom just stared at her phone, pretending she didn't hear. By high school, I had my escape plan. I maintained decent grades, despite Dad's predictions, worked part-time at the local grocery store, which Dad called playing shop, and saved every penny I could. I had exactly one friend whose parents let me crash on their couch when things got bad at home. Alan was the kind of friend everyone deserves, but few people actually get. The breaking point came 3 days after my high school graduation. I had been accepted to community college for the fall, nothing fancy, but it was something. Dad had refused to attend the ceremony, saying there was no point celebrating mediocrity. That night, we were having dinner, if you can call microwaved lasagna and uncomfortable silence dinner. Dad started in about how I needed to pay more rent if I was staying home during college. I mentioned I'd been looking at cheap apartments with roommates. That's when he lost it. He threw his fork down so hard it bounced off the table. He started going off about how I'd never survive on my own, how I'd come crawling back within a month, how I'd never amount to anything because I was just like my mother's side of the family, lazy, entitled, and destined for failure. Mom just sat there, eyes on her plate, not a word. I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I just got up, went to my room, and started packing. I could hear him in the kitchen, still ranting to Mom about her defective genes, ruining his only shot at having a son worth a damn. The next morning, I loaded my ancient Honda Civic, which I'd bought myself, BTW, with everything I cared about, which wasn't much. Dad stood in the doorway, smirking like he was watching a show he'd seen before and knew the ending to. He told me he'd leave the porch light on for when I failed. Mom stood behind him, eyes red, but silent as always. I drove straight to Alan's house and crashed on his couch for 2 weeks until I found a room to rent in a sketchy part of town. It was all I could afford on my grocery store salary. Those first few months were rough, Ramen for breakfast, lunch, and dinner rough. Choosing between bus fare and toothpaste rough. Sleeping on a mattress on the floor with no frame rough. But every time I thought about going back, I'd remember the look on Dad's face, that smug certainty that I would fail. I started community college that fall while working full-time. My grades weren't stellar, but I was passing. Then I met Heather in my English comp class. She was smart, funny, and for some reason thought I was worth dating. First person besides Alan, who seemed to think I wasn't destined for failure. About 6 months after I left home, Uncle Roy reached out through Alan's mom. Apparently, Mom had secretly given her my contact info. Roy wanted to meet for coffee. I barely knew the guy. Dad had made sure of that, limiting family visits to my mom's side. But I figured I had nothing to lose. That coffee changed everything. Uncle Roy wasn't anything like Dad had described. He wasn't lazy or stupid or worthless. He owned 3 rental properties, had invested in the stock market since his 20s, and knew more about financial planning than anyone I'd ever met. When I told him my situation, he didn't offer me money, which I respect. Instead, he offered knowledge, started teaching me about investing, about building credit, about looking for opportunities, even let me help with maintenance on his properties for extra cash and to learn some skills. Years passed. I barely thought about my parents. No calls on birthdays or holidays, no social media connections, nothing. I finished my associate's degree, then transferred to a state university for finance. Met some solid professors who helped me land an internship. Kept working with Uncle Roy on the side. All this time, Heather stuck with me. We moved in together after college, got married at the courthouse with just Alan and Uncle Roy as witnesses. No fancy ceremony, no family drama. I started small, built a decent emergency fund, then made my first investment in a foreclosure property with guidance from Roy. Fixed it up, sold it for a modest profit. Did it again and again. Started a little LLC. Nothing huge, but growing steadily. By year 10, I had a small but respectable portfolio. By year 15, I was doing well enough that Heather could quit her retail job to focus on her online classes. We bought a house, nothing fancy, but ours. No mortgage over our heads. I'd be lying if I said I never thought about my parents during those years. Sometimes I'd wonder if Dad had changed, if Mom had finally found her voice. But I never reached out. The wound had scarred over, but it still ached if pressed too hard. Then this month, Alan texted me. His mom still lived next door to my parents, and apparently things weren't good. Dad had lost his job at the factory 2 years ago and hadn't found steady work since. They'd refinanced the house multiple times. Bills were piling up. Foreclosure notices had started appearing. I told Alan I was sorry to hear it, but it wasn't my problem. Then I made the mistake of mentioning it to Uncle Roy. Roy didn't push me to reconcile or anything. He just casually mentioned that a batch of distressed mortgages was being sold off by Mid-State Bank, including some in my parents' zip code. He thought there might be some good investment opportunities there. Something clicked in my brain. I asked Roy to find out if my parents' mortgage was in that batch. A week later, he confirmed it was. Look, I'm not saying what I did next was healthy or mature or whatever, but 15 years of built-up rage and hurt doesn't just disappear. I had the means, I had the knowledge, and suddenly I had the opportunity. I set up a meeting with the bank, reviewed the portfolio, made an offer on a specific subset of mortgages, including my parents' home. The bank accepted. I didn't plan to tell them at first. Was just going to be a silent investor. But then I got curious and pulled their payment history as the new mortgage holder. It was worse than I thought. They were 4 months behind. Dad had apparently taken out a second mortgage years ago without telling Mom, based on the paperwork. The house I grew up in, The house Dad had always been so proud of was drowning in debt with him at the helm. So yeah, I did something petty. I sent a formal letter from my LLC introducing myself as the new mortgage holder and requesting a meeting to discuss the delinquency situation. I used my real name, included my phone number. 3 days later, Mom called. First time I'd heard her voice in 15 years. She was crying, barely coherent, asking if it was really me, if I was really the one who bought their mortgage. Then she said something that hit me hard. Asterisk, please don't do this to us. Not asterisk to your father asterisk, not asterisk to me asterisk, but asterisk to us asterisk. Still a unit, still defending him. I told her I'd be in town next week to discuss options. Then I hung up. So that's where I am now. Sitting in a hotel room 20 minutes from my childhood home, preparing to face the man who told me I'd never amount to anything. The man who's now financially at my mercy. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Part of me wants to show mercy. A bigger part wants to show him exactly what his worthless son has become. Either way, for the first time in my life, it's not his decision to make. It's mine. Update. First, holy crap, you guys! I didn't expect my post to blow up like this. R.I.P. my inbox. Thanks for all the awards and messages of support. For those asking if this is fake, I wish it was. Life would be a lot simpler. So, I went to see my parents yesterday. I'm typing this from my hotel room at 3 a.m. because I can't sleep. My mind keeps replaying everything that happened, and I'm still processing the whole thing. Here's the thing about planning revenge for 15 years. The reality hits different than the fantasy. Not saying I regret anything yet, but this is messier than I expected. Let me back up a bit. After my last post, I spent the morning going through the mortgage paperwork again. The numbers were even worse than I initially thought. My parents owed more on the house than it was worth, and they'd taken out a second mortgage 3 years ago that they were also behind on. From what I could piece together, Dad had been using the house like an ATM for years. Around noon, I texted Alan to see if he wanted to grab lunch before I headed over to my parents' place. We met at this dive bar we used to sneak into during high school. Still has the same greasy burgers and sticky tables. Feels like the only thing in this town that hasn't changed. Alan filled me in on what he knew about my parents' situation. Apparently, Dad got laid off when the factory downsized about 2 years ago. Since then, he's been working odd jobs, but nothing steady. Mom started working part-time at the dollar store to help with bills, but it wasn't enough. Classic Midwestern economic decline story. You know what I mean. The whole time Alan was talking, I kept thinking about how Dad always said people who couldn't hold down jobs were just lazy. How he'd mock guys who got laid off, saying they probably deserved it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I asked Alan if my dad had changed at all over the years. His expression told me everything I needed to know before he even answered. Dad was still the same bitter, angry man, just older and with less power now. Alan mentioned that he'd seen Dad yelling at Mom in the front yard a few months back about wasting money on something trivial. Some things never change. After lunch, I sat in my rental car outside my parents' house for a good 20 minutes, just staring at it. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The blue paint was peeling, the concrete steps had cracks running through them, and the yard I'd spent countless weekends mowing was overgrown. Dad's pride and joy, that house, was falling apart, just like everything else in his life. I finally worked up the courage to walk to the door, knocked twice, waited. Mom opened the door, and for a second, neither of us spoke. 15 years is a long time. Her hair had gone completely gray. She'd gained weight. The lines around her eyes and mouth had deepened. But the most noticeable change was in her posture. She seemed smaller somehow, more hunched, like life had been slowly pressing down on her shoulders for years. She didn't cry or try to hug me, which I appreciated. Instead, she just stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled exactly the same. That weird combination of Dad's aftershave, Mom's potpourri, and the lingering scent of whatever had been cooked last. Dad was sitting in his recliner in the living room, the same damn chair he'd had when I was a kid. The TV was playing some afternoon game show, volume too loud as always. He didn't stand when I walked in, just stared at me with this expression that was hard to read. Part surprise, part anger, maybe a hint of shame buried way down deep. The next hour was tense. I sat on the edge of the couch, still the same couch, just more worn, while Mom perched nervously on the armchair across from me. Dad stayed in his recliner, one hand gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles were white. I didn't waste time with small talk. I laid out the situation as directly as I could. I now owned their mortgage. They were 4 months behind on payments. The second mortgage they'd taken out was with a predatory lender charging interest that should be illegal. They were underwater on the house by about $45,000. Dad started to interrupt several times, but I just kept talking over him. 15 years ago, I couldn't do that. Now I could. The power shift in the room was palpable. When I finished explaining their financial situation, Mom asked quietly what this meant for them. What were their options? Look, I'm not going to pretend I was cool and calculated through all this. My heart was pounding the whole time, sitting across from the man who'd spent my entire childhood telling me I was worthless, watching him squirm as I explained how badly he'd screwed up his finances. It felt both better and worse than I'd imagined. I told them they had 3 options. Option 1, they could try to catch up on the payments. Given Dad's employment situation and the amount they were behind, this wasn't realistic. Option 2, they could sell the house, but since they owed more than it was worth, they'd still be in debt afterward and homeless to boot. Option 3, I could modify the loan terms. Lower interest rate, extended time frame, maybe even reduce the principal somewhat. Dad finally spoke up then, asking what the catch was for option 3. Because there's always a catch, right? I looked him right in the eyes and told him the truth. The catch was that I wanted him to admit he was wrong about me, wrong about Mom's family, wrong about everything. The look on his face. Chef's kiss. He started sputtering about how I was trying to humiliate him, how this was some sick game. Classic Dad, making himself the victim when confronted with his own BS. Mom tried to intervene, saying they were grateful I was willing to help at all. That's when Dad snapped at her to shut up, that she'd done enough damage by turning our son against me. And just like that, I was 10 years old again, watching Dad berate Mom while she shrank into herself. Some things really don't change. I stood up and told them I'd give them 24 hours to think about it. Then I left, ignoring Mom calling my name as I walked to my car. Back at the hotel, I called Heather to fill her in. She asked if I was really going to go through with this, potentially putting my own parents out on the street if Dad's pride won out. Here's where it gets complicated. Am I angry? Hell yes. Do I want revenge? Absolutely. But do I want to be the reason my mom ends up homeless? That's the part I'm struggling with. Uncle Roy called while I was pacing around my hotel room. He'd heard from Mom right after I left. Apparently, Dad was on a rampage, breaking dishes and shouting about how I was trying to destroy him. Mom was scared. Roy suggested I meet him for breakfast tomorrow to talk strategy. He knows Dad better than most people, having grown up watching him mistreat his sister. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Mom, saying she'd gotten a cheap prepaid phone so she could contact me without Dad knowing. She wanted to meet privately tomorrow. Then, at midnight, another text came through, from Alan this time. His mom had called him because there was shouting coming from my parents' house. Apparently, Dad was drinking heavily and threatening to burn the house down before letting me win. So that's where things stand now. In 12 hours, I'm supposed to go back to that house and give them my decision. Dad's spiraling. Mom's secretly reaching out. And I'm sitting here in a hotel room wondering if I've gone too far or not far enough. The thing is, this isn't just about the money. It never was. This is about the years of being told I was nothing, about watching my mom get beaten down emotionally day after day, about having to build myself from scratch because the person who was supposed to give me a foundation instead gave me wounds. When Dad told me I'd never amount to anything, he wasn't making a prediction. He was making a promise. He was promising to never see value in me no matter what I achieved. Well, now I've achieved something he can't ignore. I literally own the roof over his head. And part of me, a big part if I'm being honest, wants him to know what it feels like to be completely at someone else's mercy, to have your worth determined by someone who's already decided you're worthless. Is that petty? Probably. Justified? I think so, but I'm also aware that I'm walking a line here. Revenge feels good until it doesn't. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. Option 3 is still on the table. I could help them keep the house, but only if Dad publicly acknowledges how wrong he was. Not just about me, but about how he's treated Mom all these years. Or I could just foreclose, follow the letter of the contract they signed. Business is business, right? That's what Dad always preached. For 15 years, I've carried his voice in my head, telling me I'm nothing. Tomorrow, I get to decide if he keeps a roof over his. I'll update again after everything goes down. Thanks for listening, Reddit. Typing this out has actually helped clear my head a bit. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least I know one thing for certain. I did amount to something, and that something has the power to finally make him see it. Update 2. I didn't sleep at all last night. Just kept scrolling through all your comments, thinking about what I was going to do. Lots of you were telling me to burn it all down. Others said I should show mercy. TBH, I wasn't sure myself until I was actually standing there. So here's what went down. Buckle up. I met Uncle Roy for breakfast at this dingy diner downtown. Place still serves the same greasy hash browns they did when I was a kid. Some things in this town never change. Roy looked tired. He told me Mom had called him 3 more times overnight. Dad had been drinking heavily, alternating between rage and self-pity. At one point, he'd packed a bag and threatened to leave, then unpacked it and passed out on the couch. Classic Richard behavior. All drama. No follow-through. We sat there for almost 2 hours, picking at our food while Roy filled me in on 15 years of family history I'd missed. Holidays I hadn't been part of. Health scares no one had told me about. The slow, steady decline of my parents' marriage and finances. Look, I went into this thinking it was just about Dad, that Mom was a victim I might need to help as collateral damage. But Roy helped me see something I'd been avoiding. Mom had choices too. She chose to stay. She chose to defend him. She chose not to reach out to me for 15 years until she needed something. Around 10, I got a text from Mom asking to meet her at the park before I came to the house. I told Roy, and he just shook his head. Said she'd been trying to manage Dad and keep peace for so long, she didn't know any other way to exist. I drove to the park anyway. Found Mom sitting on a bench near the playground, bundled up against the October chill. She looked smaller in daylight, more fragile, but there was something else too, a nervousness that went beyond our situation. She kept glancing at her phone, checking the time. She started with small talk, asking about my life, my wife, if we had kids. I answered minimally. Then she got to the point. Mom wanted me to help them keep the house, but she knew Dad would never agree to my terms. His pride wouldn't let him admit he was wrong about me. She suggested a compromise. She would sign paperwork acknowledging everything, and I could modify their loan without Dad having to say anything. She'd figure out how to make the payment somehow. I asked her why she was still protecting him after everything. Why, after 15 years of no contact with her only child, she was still putting his feelings first. That's when she said something that actually made me pause. She told me she wasn't protecting him. She was protecting herself. Admitting how wrong they'd both been would mean facing the fact that she'd failed as a mother, that she'd allowed her husband to drive away their son and done nothing to stop it. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say. I told her I'd think about it, but we both knew what that meant. When I pulled up to the house an hour later, Dad was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, face set in that familiar scowl. Behind him, I could see Mom hovering in the doorway, her expression tense. The inside of the house was different from yesterday. They'd cleaned up. The living room was tidied, dishes washed, even some sad attempt at decorating with a vase of grocery store flowers on the coffee table. Like putting lipstick on a pig, as Dad used to say. I set my laptop on the kitchen table and pulled up the documents I'd prepared. 3 options, just like I'd explained yesterday. The foreclosure papers were already filled out and ready to file. The loan modification agreement was there too, with my conditions clearly spelled out. Dad sat across from me, looking at the papers but not touching them. He asked if I was enjoying this, if humiliating him was worth the trouble I'd gone through. I told him this wasn't about enjoyment. It was about consequences. For 15 years, I'd lived with the consequences of his words and actions. Now it was his turn. Mom stood by the sink, twisting a dish towel in her hands. She asked if I'd thought about her suggestion from earlier. I looked at her, then at Dad, and said everything needed to be out in the open now. No more secrets. No more enabling. Dad's face went red. He demanded to know what she'd done. When she admitted she'd met me privately, he exploded. Started calling her names, saying she'd betrayed him just like everyone else in her useless family. And that's when it happened. The moment I'll probably replay in my head for years. Mom slammed the dish towel down on the counter and yelled back. Actually yelled. She told him to shut up, that she was tired of his bullshit, that he'd driven away their son, ruined their finances, and made her life miserable for decades, and she was done taking the blame. Dad looked like she'd slapped him. In all my childhood, I'd never heard Mom raise her voice to him, not once. In the silence that followed, I pushed the loan modification papers toward them, told them my terms were non-negotiable. If they wanted to keep the house, Dad would need to acknowledge in writing that he'd been wrong about me, wrong about Mom's family, and wrong about his financial decisions. The document included a payment plan they could actually afford, with a significantly reduced interest rate. Mom looked at Dad. For once, she wasn't pleading or accommodating. She was challenging. Dad stared at the papers for what felt like forever. Then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. Not a happy laugh, one of those bitter, defeated sounds. He said I'd turned out just like him after all, using money and power to control people, making others bend to my will. I told him he was wrong. I wasn't like him. I was giving them a choice. He never gave anyone choices. He asked what would happen if he told me to go to hell. I pointed to the foreclosure papers, told him they'd have 30 days to vacate. No extensions, no mercy. Dad looked at Mom then, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. He asked if she wanted to keep the house. She said she did, that despite everything, it was still her home. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking. From anger or age or both, I couldn't tell. He signed the acknowledgement, then slid it back to me without making eye contact. I had him read it aloud, every word, every admission of how wrong he'd been about me. about Uncle Roy, about Mom's family, about his own financial decisions. His voice got quieter with each sentence, but he finished it. Mom signed next. Her hand was steady. I signed last, then handed them their copy of the agreement. Told them their first reduced payment would be due on the 1st of next month. That all communication going forward would be through my attorney. That this wasn't forgiveness. It was a business arrangement. As I was packing up my laptop, Dad asked if this made me happy, if hurting him back fixed what he'd done to me. I told him the truth. No, it didn't fix anything. But it wasn't about fixing the past. It was about controlling the future. My future. One where he had no power over me or my choices. Mom walked me to the door. She asked if I would visit again sometime, maybe for holidays. I told her I'd think about it, but we both knew what that meant too. In the car, I sat for a minute, just breathing. 15 years of anger doesn't just disappear with one confrontation. But something had shifted. The voice in my head telling me I was worthless. It wasn't as loud anymore. I drove straight to the airport and caught the first flight home. Didn't even go back to the hotel for my stuff. Just asked the front desk to ship it. Heather was waiting when I got home. One look at my face and she knew. She didn't ask for details, just poured me a drink and sat with me on the couch while I stared at the wall for hours. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've been mostly functioning on autopilot, working, eating, sleeping, but also thinking a lot about cycles and patterns and how hard they are to break. I'm not going to pretend this was some clean, healing experience. It wasn't. Dad's still an asshole. Mom's still enabling him, even with her moment of backbone. And I'm still carrying wounds that probably won't ever fully heal. But I did something I needed to do. I showed up. I set terms. I took control. The mortgage payment will come due next week. My attorney will handle it. I don't need to see or speak to them again if I don't want to. And right now, I don't want to. This morning, Uncle Roy texted to say Mom's looking into apartments. Apparently, she told Dad she's thinking about leaving. Maybe she will. Maybe she won't. Not my problem anymore. Alan invited me back for his daughter's graduation next spring. Said I should bring Heather, meet his kids properly. I might do that. The town holds less power over me now. So that's it, Reddit. The end of a 15-year journey that started with, "You'll never amount to anything," and ended with me holding the deed to my childhood home. Not exactly the heartwarming reunion story people hope for, but it's mine. Some of you will think I went too far. Others will think I didn't go far enough. TBH, I'm still figuring out where I land on that spectrum myself. What I do know is this. Sometimes revenge doesn't taste as sweet as you imagined. Sometimes it's complicated and messy and leaves you feeling hollow. But sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's the only way to finally close a door that's been left open for too long. As for forgiveness, maybe someday, but not today. Today, I'm just a guy who proved his dad wrong. And for now, that's enough.